I'm dying. Pancreatic cancer. 3 months, maybe 4. And I'll be damned if I take this to my grave. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 78 years old, and for the past 41 years, I've carried a secret that has cost me everything I once held dear. My marriage, my career, my peace of mind. Friends who thought I'd lost my sanity, family members who stopped returning my calls. All because of what I witnessed in the Cascade Mountains in the spring of 1983. What I'm about to tell you involves creatures that the scientific establishment insists cannot exist, but that's only half the story. Because those creatures, the ones we call Bigfoot, the ones the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest have known about for thousands of years, they're not just some undiscovered primate hiding in the woods. They're the guardians of something so powerful, so revolutionary, that the United States government has been hunting them for decades. I spent 3 years protecting a family of these beings. 3 years watching them, learning from them, building a trust that transcended everything I thought I knew about the world. And during that time, I discovered what they were really protecting. An energy source so clean, so constant, so infinite that it would render every oil well, every nuclear plant, every coal mine on Earth completely obsolete overnight. A single crystalline formation that could power entire cities without ever dimming, without ever running out. And the men in black suits who came hunting for it, they weren't from any agency you've ever heard of. They weren't FBI or CIA or NSA. They came from the shadows between those agencies, from the dark spaces where official records don't exist and congressional oversight never reaches. This secret has cost lives, it destroyed careers, and it nearly killed me on 3 separate occasions. But I survived. I survived because those creatures protected me just as fiercely as I tried to protect them. And now, with the time I have left measured in weeks rather than years, I'm finally going to tell you everything. But to understand what they were really after, you need to understand how I first stumbled into this impossible world. In 1983, I was 37 years old, working as a special investigator for the United States Forest Service. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it suited me. My work involved investigating crimes on federal forest land, poaching, illegal logging operations, marijuana cultivation hidden deep in the backcountry, and occasionally the worst part of the job, missing persons cases that almost never ended well. I'd come to the Forest Service through an unconventional path, served as a military police officer in Vietnam, came home with medals I didn't want and memories I couldn't escape. Tried to join the FBI, made it through most of the academy, but washed out in the final evaluation. Too independent, they said. Didn't play well with authority. Couldn't follow orders I thought were stupid. Looking back, they weren't wrong. The Forest Service was a better fit. Out in the wilderness, you made your own decisions. You lived or died by your own judgment. There was no bureaucracy breathing down your neck when you were 30 miles from the nearest road, tracking poachers through old-growth timber. My colleagues called me the bloodhound. I could track anything through almost any terrain. A skill I'd learned in Vietnam, refined over 15 years in the Pacific Northwest forests. I knew how animals moved, how humans moved, how to read the story written in broken branches and disturbed soil. It was the one thing I was truly good at. By 1983, I was recently divorced. Sandra had finally had enough of a husband who was gone for weeks at a time, who came home smelling like campfire smoke and couldn't talk about anything except his cases. She wasn't wrong to leave. I didn't fight it. In truth, I preferred the wilderness to people anyway. The trees didn't judge you. The mountains didn't expect you to be something you weren't. In March of that year, I was called to regional headquarters in Portland, Oregon. This was unusual. I normally received my assignments through my direct supervisor, a retired ranger named Bill Hartley, who operated out of a cramped office in Olympia. But this meeting was different. I was told to report to Deputy Director Alan Frost, a man I'd never met and whose name I didn't even recognize. Frost's office was on the 5th floor, all mahogany and leather and the smell of expensive coffee. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, with the kind of handshake that tested your grip strength. Behind him, instead of the usual government landscape paintings, there was a detailed topographic map of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. He got right to the point. Over the previous 18 months, 5 men had disappeared in a remote section of the forest, an area near Mount St. Helens, still recovering from its catastrophic eruption 3 years earlier. All 5 were government surveyors and geologists, working under contract for the Department of Energy. The official explanation for each disappearance was bear attack. Standard boilerplate for unexplained wilderness deaths. But here's the thing, no bodies were ever recovered. Not a single one. Bears don't clean up after themselves that thoroughly. In my experience, large predator attacks leave evidence: clothing, equipment, bones, something. 5 men vanishing without a trace suggested something other than bear attacks. Deputy Director Frost wanted me to find out what really happened. He was very specific about my instructions. I was to report directly to him, not to my regular supervisor. I was not to discuss the case with anyone. I was to treat every aspect of the investigation as classified. At the time, I thought this was standard government paranoia, covering up potential negligence, avoiding lawsuits from the victims' families. I had no idea what I was actually walking into. The Gifford-Pinchot National Forest covers 1.3 million acres of some of the most rugged wilderness in the continental United States. Dense old-growth timber, steep volcanic terrain, countless streams and rivers cutting through valleys that see no human visitors for years at a time. The specific area I was assigned to investigate was particularly remote. Access was limited to a handful of deteriorating logging roads that had been abandoned after the mountain's eruption. I remember the drive vividly. My vehicle was a 1979 Ford Bronco, forest green, with a heater that only worked when it felt like it and a cassette player that ate tapes if you looked at it wrong. I had Fleetwood Mac playing as I climbed the mountain roads, Stevie Nicks singing about landslides while the ash-gray skies pressed down and rain streaked my windshield. March in the Cascades is a particular kind of miserable, cold rain that seeps into every layer of clothing, patches of rotten snow that collapse under your weight, fog that rolls through the valleys so thick you can't see 20 feet. The landscape near Mount St. Helens was still recovering from the 1980 eruption. Entire hillsides stripped bare dead timber, lying in tangled windrows, the ground coated in volcanic ash that turned to gray paste when wet. I established my base camp at an abandoned logging site, a wide clearing with the remnants of a trailer and a collapsed equipment shed. The first person I met was the local ranger assigned to the area, a man named Dale Hutchins. Dale was in his early 60s, close to retirement, with the weathered face and careful eyes of someone who'd spent his entire life in the wilderness. He met me at the site with a thermos of coffee and a worried expression. The first thing Dale told me was that the Cowlitz people, the indigenous tribe whose ancestral territory included these forests, wouldn't go into this section of woods anymore. Hadn't for 3 years, since before the mountain even erupted. When I asked why, Dale just shook his head. Said they knew things about these forests that white men had never learned, and they were smart enough to listen to what the land told them. I pressed him for more information about the missing surveyors. He showed me the last known locations, all marked on a topographic map. The pattern was immediately obvious. All 5 men had disappeared within a 2-mile radius of the same coordinates. The center of that radius was a section of terrain so steep and densely forested that it didn't even appear on most hiking maps. Before he left, Dale paused at the door of his truck. He looked back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Part warning, part fear, part something that might have been embarrassment. He said he'd seen things up there. Things he couldn't explain. Things he'd never put in any official report, because he wanted to keep his job and his pension and his reputation. He told me to be careful. Then he drove away and I didn't see him again for almost 2 weeks. The first sign that something was wrong came before I even reached the primary search area. I spent my first full day doing standard reconnaissance, checking the terrain, marking potential routes, getting a feel for the landscape. Standard procedure for any wilderness investigation. I parked the Bronco at the end of a washed-out logging road and hiked 3 miles into the target zone, following the drainage of a small creek that wound its way down from higher elevations. The forest here was dense and dark, old-growth Douglas fir and western red cedar, some of them 300 years old or more, with trunks so wide you couldn't wrap your arms around them. The canopy above was so thick that even at midday, the light that reached the forest floor was dim and greenish, filtered through countless layers of needles. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Wet pine needles and decaying vegetation. Nothing unusual there, but underneath it something else. A sharp, mineral quality that reminded me of hot springs, of volcanic activity. The mountain was still geologically active, so perhaps this wasn't surprising, but it was stronger than I expected, concentrated in certain areas. The second thing I noticed was the silence. In a healthy forest, there's always sound, birdsong, the chatter of squirrels, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. But as I hiked deeper into the target zone, all of that gradually faded away. By the time I reached the coordinates at the center of the missing surveyors' disappearances, the forest was absolutely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. I've experienced this phenomenon before in my career. It usually means one thing: a large predator in the area. Bears, mountain lions. They create zones of silence around themselves as smaller animals freeze or hide, but this was different. This silence extended for hundreds of yards in every direction. No single predator creates that kind of effect. I found the first footprint near a stream crossing. My body actually stopped moving before my brain registered what my eyes were seeing. The print was pressed into a patch of soft mud at the water's edge, 18 inches long, 5 distinct toes, almost human in configuration, but the proportions were all wrong, too wide, too deep. My first thought was hoax. Someone with carved wooden feet playing an elaborate joke. It had happened before, especially after the famous Patterson-Gimlin film in 1967. Every other month some joker was running around the Pacific Northwest in a gorilla suit, making fake footprints for newspaper attention. But then I looked at the stride length. Whoever or whatever made these tracks was stepping more than 5 feet between footfalls. You can't fake that. No human being can maintain that stride length through rough terrain, not while also pressing deep enough into the mud to leave 18-inch footprints. I followed the tracks deeper into the forest. The forest changed the deeper I went. It's hard to explain unless you've experienced it yourself, but there's a quality to truly wild places that you don't find anywhere else. The air tastes different, the silence has weight to it. And that afternoon, following those impossible tracks through the Cascade Wilderness, I felt like I was crossing some invisible boundary into a world that didn't operate by the rules I understood. The tracks led me through a section of old-growth timber that had somehow survived the logging operations of the previous decades. Douglas firs that were already ancient when Columbus made landfall, western red cedars with trunks so massive that 3 men linking hands couldn't encircle them. The canopy was so thick overhead that the forest floor existed in a kind of perpetual twilight, even though my watch told me it was only 3 in the afternoon. And that's when I noticed the silence, not the natural quiet of a forest at rest, but something else entirely. No birdsong, no squirrel chatter, no rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. In my years working the forests, I'd learned that this kind of silence means one thing: there's a predator nearby and every living thing knows it. My hand went to my revolver, but I didn't draw it. Something stopped me. Call it instinct, call it intuition, call it temporary insanity, but I had the overwhelming sense that pulling my weapon would be exactly the wrong move. That's when I smelled it. A musky, powerful odor unlike anything I'd encountered in all my years in the wilderness. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it was overwhelming. Primal. It reminded me of the great ape house at a zoo, but wilder, richer, mixed with the scent of pine and rain-soaked earth. And then I heard the sound. A low, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It resonated in my chest, in my bones, like standing too close to a bass speaker at a concert. It wasn't aggressive, not exactly, but it was unmistakably a warning. Something was telling me that I had wandered into territory where I didn't belong. I should have run. Every survival instinct I'd developed over years of working in dangerous situations was screaming at me to get out, to retreat to my vehicle, to radio for backup and return with a team. But I couldn't move, not because I was paralyzed with fear, although fear was certainly part of it. No, what held me in place was something I'd never experienced before, a profound, almost spiritual sense of awe. I stood in a small clearing, the late afternoon light, filtering through gaps in the canopy and golden shafts that illuminated the mist rising from the damp earth. And at the tree line, maybe 50 yards away, I saw movement. At first my mind refused to process what my eyes were showing me. The shape was wrong, too large, too upright, too impossibly real. It stepped partially out from behind an enormous cedar, and for the first time in my life, I understood what people meant when they talked about having the breath knocked out of them. It stood at least 8 feet tall, covered head to toe in dark reddish-brown hair that caught the dappled light and seemed almost to glow. Its body was humanoid but massively built, with shoulders that must have been 4 feet across and arms that hung down past its knees. The proportions were wrong for a human, wrong for any ape I'd ever seen in books or zoos. But it was the face that I'll never forget. Not the monstrous visage of horror movies, not the ape-like features of hoax photographs. No, this face was almost human. A heavy brow ridge shadowed deep-set eyes that caught the light and reflected an intelligence that was unmistakable. A broad, flat nose. Thin lips set in an expression I can only describe as contemplative. It was watching me, studying me. And in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that I was looking at another, thinking being. My hand was still resting on my revolver, but the idea of drawing it now seemed absurd, like pulling a weapon on a person you'd just met on the street. This wasn't a threat display. It wasn't even curiosity in the way an animal might be curious about an intruder. This was an assessment. It was deciding what to make of me. I don't know how long we stood there. It could have been 30 seconds or 10 minutes. Time had lost all meaning. The creature tilted its head slightly, a gesture so human that it sent a shiver down my spine. Then it made a sound, low and rumbling, almost like a question. I didn't know how to respond. What do you say when everything you thought you knew about the world is proven wrong in a single instant? But I did something instinctive, something that probably saved my life, or at least saved this incredible opportunity. I slowly, carefully sat down on the ground. I made myself small, non-threatening. I kept my hands visible and my eyes down, only occasionally glancing up to make sure the creature was still there. It watched me sit. It watched me make myself vulnerable, and then, impossibly, miraculously, it turned and walked back into the forest. Not running, not fleeing, just walking. Like it had seen what it needed to see, and had other places to be. It moved without a sound. 8 feet tall and probably 600 pounds, and it slipped between the trees like smoke, like shadow, like something that had been perfecting the art of invisibility for 1,000 generations. I sat there for 10 full minutes after it disappeared, my mind racing, my heart pounding, my entire worldview crumbling into dust. Everything I thought I knew was wrong. That night, back at my base camp in the abandoned logging site, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my sleeping bag in the back of my Bronco, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what I'd witnessed. I'd been trained to observe, to analyze, to draw conclusions based on evidence, and the evidence was clear. I had seen something that the scientific establishment said didn't exist. I found myself sketching what I'd seen by flashlight, trying to capture the details before they faded from memory. The proportions of the body, the way the light caught the reddish tones in its hair, the depth of intelligence in those deep-set eyes, and I faced a choice. The protocol was clear. I should report what I'd seen, request backup, return to the area with a team of experts who could document this discovery. But I knew what would happen if I did that. I'd be labeled a crackpot. My career would be over. The powers that be would dismiss my report as the ravings of a man who'd spent too much time alone in the wilderness. Worse, if they did believe me, what then? A circus would descend on this forest. Scientists, journalists, hunters, thrill-seekers. The creature I'd seen and whatever family or community it belonged to would be hunted, captured, dissected, put on display. Everything that made this place sacred would be destroyed. I made a decision that night that changed the course of my life. I decided to go back. Not with a team, not with cameras and tranquilizer guns and helicopter support. Just me, just Marcus Webb, alone in the wilderness, trying to understand something that defied understanding. I needed to know more before I decided what to do with this knowledge. At dawn, I gathered supplies. Not weapons, not capture equipment. Food, apples from my personal stash, some beef jerky, a can of tuna I'd been saving for dinner, offerings, gifts, the kind of thing you might bring when you're trying to make friends with a neighbor. I felt foolish walking back into those woods with a bag of groceries, but something told me this was the right approach. This wasn't an animal to be studied from a safe distance. This was a person, or something very close to a person, and people respond to kindness. I found my way back to the clearing where I'd had my first sighting. It looked different in the morning light, less magical, more mundane. Just a gap in the trees where sunlight reached the forest floor. I placed my offerings on a flat rock near the center of the clearing, then retreated to the edge, sat down and waited. Nothing happened that first day. I sat there for 6 hours, barely moving, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. Squirrels returned first, then birds. The forest slowly came back to life around me, as if whatever presence had suppressed all activity had departed. Eventually the light began to fade, and I had no choice but to return to camp. I went back the next day. Same routine, offerings on the rock, retreat to the edge, sit and wait. This time I noticed that the food from the previous day was gone, something had taken it. I couldn't be sure what, but I chose to believe it was a good sign. On the third day it came back. I saw movement in the same spot where I'd first glimpsed it, that massive cedar at the tree line. The creature stepped into view, and my heart nearly stopped. It was real. I hadn't imagined it. I wasn't going crazy, but this time something was different. It didn't stay hidden at the edge of the clearing. Slowly, cautiously, it walked toward the center of the space. Toward the rock where I'd left my offerings. Toward me. I forced myself to stay seated. Forced myself to keep breathing. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to run, but I knew that running would end this. Whatever connection I was building would be shattered. The creature stopped about 30 yards away and stood watching me. Minutes passed, neither of us moved. And then I did something that, looking back, was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. I sat down completely, not on my haunches, ready to spring up and run, but fully seated, legs crossed, hands resting on my knees. Completely vulnerable, completely at its mercy. The creature tilted its head in that eerily human gesture. And then impossibly, it sat down too, not crouching, not squatting, sitting, mirroring my posture almost exactly. We sat there together, 30 yards apart, for what must have been an hour. No sounds except the wind in the trees, and the occasional call of a distant bird. No movement except the gentle sway of branches, and the slow blink of those intelligent eyes. And then it did something that changes a man's soul. It made a sound, low and rumbling, but gentle now, almost like a purr. And it reached out and placed its hand on the ground, palm up, in a gesture that was unmistakably an invitation. I didn't approach that day. I wasn't ready, and I don't think it expected me to be. But when I came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and for weeks and months to come, that gesture was the beginning of something I never could have imagined. A relationship. A friendship. A bond between two beings who should never have been able to understand each other at all. I started calling him Solomon, after the wise king of biblical legend. It seemed fitting, because in his eyes, I saw a wisdom that put most humans to shame. Those early weeks were a process of patient communication. I would speak slowly, using simple words and gestures. Solomon would respond with his own vocalizations, a complex language of rumbles and clicks and howls that I began to recognize and differentiate. We were learning each other, like two people who speak different languages but are determined to find common ground. The breakthrough came about 3 weeks in, when Solomon brought me something. He approached with his hand closed, then opened it to reveal a perfectly round stone, polished, smooth by centuries of water. He placed it in my palm, and made a sound that I had come to associate with positive emotions. It was a gift. He had brought me a gift. In that moment I understood something fundamental. I wasn't studying a specimen. I wasn't observing an animal. I was building a friendship with a person who happened to belong to a species that science said couldn't exist, and everything I thought I knew about my mission, my duty, my purpose in those woods began to shift. Week 6 brought a revelation that changed everything. Solomon didn't come to our clearing alone that morning. As I sat on my usual fallen log, unwrapping an apple from my pack, I caught movement at the tree line. Multiple shapes, multiple silhouettes. My hand instinctively moved toward my revolver, but Solomon stepped forward and made a calming gesture I had come to recognize. He was telling me there was no danger. He was telling me to trust him. From the shadows emerged a female slightly smaller than Solomon, perhaps 7 feet tall, with lighter brown fur that caught the morning light like burnished copper. Behind her came two juveniles, gangly and curious, their eyes wide with what I can only describe as wonder, a family. Solomon had brought me his family. I named the female Miriam, after my grandmother who had passed when I was young. The juveniles I called Samuel and Ruth, biblical names that seemed fitting for creatures who carried themselves with such ancient dignity. For weeks they observed me from a distance while Solomon and I continued our daily rituals, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, they began to approach. Samuel was the braver of the two young ones, often venturing within 20 feet to study the strange metal objects I carried. Ruth preferred to watch from her mother's side, though I occasionally caught her mimicking my gestures when she thought I wasn't looking. Miriam never came as close as Solomon, but she watched, always watching. Assessing, deciding whether this strange hairless creature could be trusted with her children. I understood that vigilance, I respected it deeply. Something shifted in me during those weeks. I stopped thinking of myself as an investigator and started thinking of myself as a guest. These weren't subjects to be studied. They were people who had opened their world to me, shown me their family, extended trust that I had done nothing to earn. And I understood with growing certainty that I would do anything to protect them. It was during week 10 that Solomon invited me into their true home. The morning had started like any other. I arrived at the clearing with my usual offerings, sat in my usual spot, waited for my usual companion. But when Solomon appeared, he didn't sit down. Instead, he gestured toward the deeper forest, a beckoning motion, an invitation. He wanted me to follow him. I should have hesitated. Protocol demanded that I radio in my position, leave markers, take precautions. But I had stopped following protocol weeks ago. I had stopped following anything except my instincts and the growing conviction that whatever was happening in these woods was bigger than any government investigation. We walked for 2 hours through terrain I couldn't have navigated alone. Up cliff faces that seemed impossible to climb, through hidden passages between boulders that appeared solid until you approached at exactly the right angle, across streams using stepping stones that were invisible unless you knew precisely where to look. I realized with mounting amazement that no human could ever find this place without a guide. The path wasn't just hidden, it was engineered to be invisible. Generations of these creatures had crafted an approach that defied tracking, mapping, or accidental discovery. And then we emerged into the valley. I have struggled for 40 years to find words adequate to describe what I saw. The valley was perhaps half a mile across, completely enclosed by steep rock walls that rose hundreds of feet on every side. A waterfall cascaded down the eastern face, feeding a crystal-clear stream that wound through the center of the space. Vegetation grew in abundance, far more lush than anything in the surrounding forest. But it wasn't the natural beauty that stole my breath. There were more of them, so many more, perhaps 30 individuals that I could count, engaged in what I can only describe as daily life. Some gathered food near the stream. Others tended to what appeared to be shelters woven from branches and bark. A group of juveniles played some sort of game that involved throwing stones at a target. Elders sat together in a shaded area, their silver-streaked fur marking their age. A community, a civilization, hidden in the heart of a forest that humans thought they had mapped and measured and understood. Solomon led me through the valley, and I was aware of every eye upon me. Some watched with curiosity, others with suspicion, a few with something that looked disturbingly like recognition, as though they had been told about me, had been waiting to see the strange creature that had befriended one of their own. And then I saw the cave. At the far end of the valley, a cave mouth opened in the rock face. But unlike any cave I had ever seen, this one glowed. A soft blue-white light pulsed from within, steady as a heartbeat, illuminating the entrance with an ethereal radiance that seemed to push back against the shadows. Solomon led me toward it, and I felt the air change as we approached. Warmer, charged with something I couldn't identify but could feel in my teeth, in my bones, in the hair standing up along my arms. Inside the cave I found the heart of the mystery. A crystalline formation, roughly the size of a small car, protruded from the rock floor. It was beautiful beyond description, faceted like a gem but organic in shape, growing from the earth itself. The light emanated from deep within its structure, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed almost biological. I stood before it, transfixed, and understood immediately why 5 government surveyors had died. This was what they had found. This was what they had been searching for. And these creatures had protected it, as their ancestors had protected it, for longer than human civilization had existed. Over the following weeks, I returned to the valley many times. I observed. I learned. I tried to understand. The crystal never dimmed, never flickered, never showed any sign of diminishing or exhausting itself. Whatever energy it produced seemed genuinely infinite, drawing from some source I couldn't begin to comprehend. The creatures used it primarily for warmth. On cold nights, families would gather near the cave, basking in the radiation that seemed to comfort rather than harm them. The juveniles played in its light, casting strange shadows on the cave walls. I noticed other effects as well. The vegetation near the cave grew far more abundantly than anywhere else in the valley. Animals that ventured close seemed healthier, more vibrant. The stream that passed near the cave's entrance ran warmer than it should have, never freezing even in the coldest temperatures. My background in Army engineering gave me enough knowledge to recognize what I was seeing. This was energy. Pure, constant, limitless energy. If harnessed properly, this single formation could power a city indefinitely. And if there were others like it, scattered in other hidden valleys across the world, the implications were beyond calculation. Every oil well on Earth would become worthless overnight. Every nuclear power plant would be obsolete. Every war fought over petroleum. Every economy built on fossil fuels. Every power structure dependent on controlling energy resources would crumble into irrelevance. I understood why men would kill for this. I understood why governments would hunt for it across decades. And I understood why these creatures had learned to hide so thoroughly that even with all our technology, all our resources, all our desperate searching, we had never found them. Through weeks of patient communication, using gestures and drawings scratched in the dirt and sounds that I slowly learned to interpret, I pieced together their history with the crystal. They called it something that sounded like Mahura. The closest translation I could manage was the heart that beats forever. They had guarded it for generations beyond counting, protecting it not because they needed its power for themselves, but because they understood what would happen if humans found it. They had watched humanity from the shadows since before we had writing. They had seen us develop agriculture, build cities, wage wars, advance and retreat and advance again. They had witnessed every empire rise and fall, every technology emerge, every crisis we created and sometimes survived. And they had made a judgment, passed down through countless generations, that we were not ready. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. Ancient humans had known about them. Indigenous peoples across this continent had traded with them, respected them, honored the sacred boundaries around their hidden valleys. But when the new humans came, with their machines and their greed and their conviction that everything was theirs to take, the creatures had retreated further into the wild places. The first modern surveyors had come years before those 5 I was supposed to be investigating. Geological teams following unusual energy readings that their instruments couldn't explain. Prospectors convinced they were on the trail of some new radioactive element. Government scientists who dismissed legends of forest giants until they found footprints too large to be hoaxed. The creatures had tried to warn them. They always tried warning first. Strange sounds in the night, trails that led nowhere, equipment that malfunctioned inexplicably. Most humans took the hint and left. But some didn't. Some kept pushing, kept probing, kept advancing toward the secret that was never meant for them. And when warnings failed, when nothing else would protect the Mahura and the families who depended on it, the creatures did what any parent would do when their home and children faced an existential threat. They defended themselves. I wrestled with this truth for many nights. 5 men were dead, not imaginary men, not abstract casualties, but 5 individuals with families of their own, with hopes and fears and futures that had been stolen from them. These creatures, my friends, had killed them, but I kept returning to the same question, the same brutal calculus that I couldn't escape. What would humans do in the same situation? If an alien force came to Earth, found the source of all our power, and threatened to take it by force, what would we do? We would fight. We would kill. We would do whatever was necessary to protect our children and our way of life, and we would call ourselves heroes for doing it. Were these creatures any different? They had tried peaceful methods first. They had given warnings, created barriers, done everything possible to avoid violence. And when those options were exhausted, when the threat would not retreat, they had done what survival demanded. I could not condemn them for that. I would not. My decision crystallized in that cave. Bathed in the blue-white glow of a power source older than human history, I would not betray them. I would not lead humanity to their door. Whatever happened next, whatever price I had to pay, I would keep their secret. But I was naive. I thought I could simply bury my report, claim the investigation was inconclusive, let the forest keep its mysteries forever. I didn't understand that someone already knew what was hidden in these woods. Someone had always known. And they were coming with resources and technology and ruthlessness beyond anything I had imagined. The first warning came when I returned to base camp after 3 months in the field. My tent had been searched. Professionally done, almost invisible but not quite invisible enough for someone with my training. My field notes were gone. My sketches of Solomon and his family had vanished. The maps I had marked with careful notations had been replaced with unmarked copies. Ranger Dale Hutchins found me standing in my violated camp, staring at the empty space where my research had been. His face was pale, his hands were shaking. 2 men had come asking about me, he said. Suits, black sedan with government plates, badges from an agency he had never heard of and couldn't remember the name of 5 minutes after they left. They had asked about unusual geological formations, indigenous wildlife activity. They had asked specifically about energy phenomena. They weren't looking for Bigfoot. I realized with dawning horror, they already knew about the creatures. What they wanted was the Mahora, the infinite power source that had eluded them for decades, and somehow they knew I was getting close to it. The clock, as they say, had started ticking. I knew I had 2 weeks, maybe less, before Operation Prometheus deployed its full extraction team. 2 weeks to do what no one had ever done before. Hide an entire civilization from the most sophisticated surveillance apparatus ever created by mankind. It sounds impossible when I say it out loud. It was impossible, but I had one advantage they hadn't counted on. I knew the land, and more importantly, the land knew me. The first thing I did was warn Solomon, not through words, of course, though our communication had grown sophisticated over those months. I used drawings in the dirt, gestures, and something that I can only describe as emotional transmission. I showed him images of men with weapons. I pointed to the sky where helicopters circled. I drew the path from the outside world to their hidden valley, and Solomon understood. I could see it in those deep, intelligent eyes. This was not the first time his people had faced such a threat. There was a weariness in his expression, a resignation that spoke of generations of running, hiding, watching their world shrink around them. But there was also determination. And when he placed his massive hand on my shoulder, that gentle weight carried a message clearer than any words could convey. We trust you. Help us. So I became a double agent in my own life. By day I filed false reports with the Forest Service, documenting my fruitless search for evidence of bear attacks. I created elaborate false trails leading away from the valley, planting footprint evidence in areas miles from the actual clan territory. I leaked information to Agents Chen and Morrison through carefully orchestrated encounters, feeding them just enough truth mixed with misdirection to keep them chasing shadows. But by night I worked with Solomon's people. The first challenge was the thermal imaging. Modern technology could detect body heat from aircraft flying thousands of feet above the forest canopy. A creature with the mass of an adult Sasquatch would light up like a bonfire on those screens. But I had underestimated Solomon's people. They had been evading human detection for thousands of years, and they had developed techniques that bordered on the miraculous. They showed me how they used the natural hot springs scattered throughout the Cascades to mask their heat signatures, positioning their dwellings near geothermal vents that created thermal noise on any scanning equipment. They had learned through bitter experience exactly how to become invisible to the mechanical eyes that hunted them. What they needed from me was different. They needed to understand the new threats, the technologies they had never encountered. So I taught them about ground-penetrating radar, explaining through demonstrations how certain rock formations could scatter and deflect the signals. Together we identified natural barriers throughout their territory that would appear as solid stone to any scanning equipment. The Mahora was the real challenge. That crystalline formation pulsed with energy that would register on any sensitive detection equipment from miles away. Moving it was impossible, both physically and spiritually. The creature's entire culture revolved around protecting and honoring that ancient power source, but we could hide it. Working together over those desperate 2 weeks, we constructed a Faraday cage of sorts using naturally occurring minerals with high iron content. The creatures understood the concept instinctively once I demonstrated it with my radio and some basic materials. They had an intuitive grasp of electromagnetic principles that would have stunned any physicist. Within days they had lined the cave with layers of magnetite and hematite, materials they harvested from deep within the mountains, using tunnels that I could never have navigated. The readings from the Mahora dropped by over 90%. It wasn't perfect. A dedicated search with the right equipment might still detect something unusual, but it would no longer broadcast its presence like a beacon across the electromagnetic spectrum. Meanwhile, Agents Chen and Morrison were growing impatient. I remember the confrontation that changed everything. It was day 11 of my 2-week countdown, and they intercepted me on a logging road about 3 miles from the valley. Their black sedan blocked the path, and both men stood waiting with expressions that had finally dropped any pretense of friendliness. "Mr. Webb, the tall one," Chen said without preamble, "we have satellite imagery from last night showing heat signatures consistent with large primates moving through Sector 7. That's an area your reports claim you thoroughly investigated and found empty." My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my voice steady. "Satellites make mistakes. Could have been elk, bears coming out of hibernation early. The mountain still vents heat from the eruption in random patterns. You know the terrain up here, it plays tricks." Morrison stepped forward, close enough that I could smell his aftershave, something chemical and antiseptic. "We also have your real field notes, Mr. Webb, the ones you thought you had hidden in your ex-wife's storage unit in Portland." The ground seemed to tilt beneath my feet. "Fascinating reading," Chen continued, his voice flat as a frozen lake. "Detailed observations of creatures matching the description of Sasquatch, communication attempts, references to a hidden valley, and most interesting of all, something you call the glowing heart. I had nothing. No defense, no clever misdirection, no escape route. They had me, and they knew it. Here's what's going to happen," Morrison said, producing a document from inside his jacket. "You're going to sign this, which authorizes your immediate transfer to our division as a special consultant. Then you're going to take us to the valley, you're going to introduce us to your friends, and you're going to help us secure the energy source. In exchange, we'll recommend that the creatures be captured and studied, rather than eliminated. A generous offer, all things considered." I looked at that document, at the official seals and signatures, at the blank line waiting for my name, and I thought about Solomon sitting peacefully in our clearing, offering me a polished stone as a gift of friendship. I thought about the juveniles playing at the edge of the valley, chasing each other through the ancient trees. I thought about the Mahora, pulsing with light that had burned since before humanity crawled out of caves, a gift from the earth itself that belonged to no government, no corporation, no nation. "No," I said. Morrison's fist connected with my stomach before I could react, doubling me over. Chen grabbed my hair and yanked my head back. "That wasn't a request," Chen said quietly. "That was the polite version. Would you like to hear the impolite version? It involves your niece, Emily. 16 years old. Just got her driver's license. She takes Route 26 to school every morning, doesn't she? Dangerous road. Accidents happen all the time." Cold fury replaced the pain in my gut. "You're going to threaten a child to get what you want? We're going to secure an energy source that could revolutionize human civilization," Chen replied without emotion. "The moral calculus isn't complicated. One girl or the future of the entire species. What would you choose?" In that moment I understood exactly what I was dealing with. These men had surrendered their humanity so completely that threatening a teenager felt like reasonable negotiation. They would burn the world to control its power, convinced that the fire was necessary, that the ashes would fertilize something better. They were the real monsters. They always had been. "All right," I said, letting my shoulders slump in defeat. "All right, you win. I'll take you to the valley, but it has to be tomorrow morning. The creatures are nomadic at night, and if we go now, they'll scatter. We'd never find them again." Chen and Morrison exchanged glances. Morrison nodded slowly. Tomorrow morning, Chen agreed. 6 a.m. sharp, you try to run, and Emily has a very bad drive to school. Understood? I understood perfectly. That night I made my way to the valley one final time. Not to warn Solomon, though I did that too. Not to say goodbye, though the weight of farewell hung heavy in the mountain air. I went to set a trap. You see, there was one thing I hadn't told Solomon's people about their defenses. While we had been shielding the Mahora and creating false trails, I had also been planting evidence. Carefully fabricated evidence that pointed to a completely different location, a cave system on the opposite side of Mount St. Helens, one that was geologically unstable and prone to collapse. In that cave I had placed a small crystalline formation, nothing special, just quartz with some unusual mineral inclusions. But I had surrounded it with radioactive material salvaged from an old geological survey site, enough to create readings that might fool detection equipment for the few crucial minutes it would take. I had also, and this part still haunts me, rigged the cave entrance with explosives. At 6 the next morning I led Agents Chen and Morrison into the forest, but not toward Solomon's Valley. I led them toward my trap. It took 4 hours of hiking through increasingly difficult terrain before we reached the cave entrance. By then both agents were exhausted, frustrated, and convinced I had been lying to them all along. "There's nothing here," Morrison snarled, his hand resting on his sidearm. "You've been wasting our time." "Just wait," I said, pointing toward the cave. "Watch." I had timed it perfectly. The morning sun had just reached the angle where it penetrated the cave entrance, hitting the quartz formation I had placed there. The crystal caught the light and scattered it into a rainbow of colors across the cave walls. It wasn't the Mahora, it wasn't even close to the real thing. But to men desperate to find what they were looking for, it was close enough. Chen's eyes went wide. He pushed past me into the cave, Morrison right behind him. I detonated the charges. The explosion brought down the cave entrance in a cascade of rock and volcanic debris, not enough to reach where the agents had run. They would be trapped, but alive, with enough air from fissures in the rock to survive until rescue came. I had calculated it carefully, too carefully perhaps, because part of me wanted them dead. But I wasn't going to become what they were. I refused to let them transform me into a murderer. I hiked out of that forest for the last time, climbed into my Bronco and drove away from the life I had known. Behind me I left 2 trapped federal agents, a career in ruins, and a family of creatures I had come to love. That was 41 years ago. I spent the next 2 decades running, hiding, living under assumed names in 7 different countries. Operation Prometheus searched for me relentlessly, but I had learned from the masters of evasion. The creatures had taught me well. The agents survived, of course. They were rescued 3 days later, dehydrated and furious but alive. Their report described me as a deranged environmentalist who had destroyed a significant geological discovery. They never mentioned the creatures, never admitted what they had really been hunting. Their masters preferred it that way. And Solomon's clan? They vanished deeper into the wilderness, into places so remote that even satellites cannot find them. I like to think they're still there, still protecting the Mahora, still living their ancient lives in harmony with a world that has forgotten they exist. I've told this story to no one until now. Even this recording may never see the light of day, but I'm dying, and dying clarifies things. The infinite power source exists. It's been burning since before humanity walked upright, and it will burn long after we're gone. The men in black know it's there. They've never stopped searching, but they'll never find it. Because some secrets are meant to stay hidden, some powers belong to those who understand their true value, and some bonds, formed between unlikely souls in the depths of ancient forests, are stronger than any government conspiracy. Solomon taught me that. It was his final gift, and now I've passed it on to you.